The moment Prince Harry received the envelope, the world he thought he knew crumbled before his eyes. The envelope was small, unassuming, but inside was a revelation that would shake the foundations of the British monarchy and alter everything Harry believed about his own life. You might be wondering, how could one piece of paper carry the weight of decades of secrets, betrayals, and heartbreak? But this was no ordinary message. It was the confirmation of a truth so explosive that it had been buried in whispers, half-truths, and silence for more than 30 years. And now, it had arrived at Harry's hands. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the world has watched Prince Harry navigate the complex, often suffocating corridors of royal life, standing in the shadow of his father, King Charles III, and older brother, Prince William. To the public, he was the fun-loving, rebellious royal, the spare to the heir, the cheeky prince who sometimes defied tradition. But behind the public persona was a man who carried the weight of his mother's death, the pressure of royal expectations, and a life shaped by secrets that the palace walls had protected. And none of those secrets, it seemed, were as personal, as intimate, or as devastating as the one contained in that envelope. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to question the very foundation of your identity? To suddenly see the person you called father in a new, unimaginable light? Imagine living your life believing one man is your parent, only to discover that everything you thought you knew was a lie. That's the shock Prince Harry faced. A DNA test confirming what the whispers had long suggested. The biological father he had always thought was Charles might not be his father at all. The truth pointed to James Hewitt, a man whose name alone conjures scandal, secrecy, and an era of Diana's life that the public only glimpsed through tabloids and whispered rumors. But before we dive into the devastating revelation itself, we need to understand why this matters. Not just for Harry, but for the royal family, for the public, and for history. This isn't just another tabloid story. This is the story of a prince grappling with his mother's secret, a man questioning his place in the family he grew up in, and a monarchy that could never have predicted the consequences of hidden truths surfacing decades later. The ripple effects are enormous, reaching far beyond palace gates. Imagine the conversations behind closed doors, the tension between brothers, the silent glares during ceremonial events, and the private anguish that history may never fully capture. To grasp the full magnitude, consider Diana's life in the late 1980s and early 1990s. She was more than a princess. She was a woman trapped in a gilded cage, adored by millions yet profoundly lonely. Her marriage to Charles was fraught with complications, infidelity, and heartbreak. While the public largely fixated on her poise, her style, and her humanitarian work, there were layers of private struggle few could ever understand. Letters, diaries, and private correspondences reveal a woman torn between duty, love, and survival. And within that private struggle, a relationship with James Hewitt blossomed, a man who would become intimately connected to Diana in a way that the palace desperately tried to conceal. Now, you might be thinking, could this really affect Harry? Wasn't he just a child at the time? Isn't he too young to have been part of this equation? But the timing is what makes this revelation so earth-shattering. The DNA evidence doesn't merely hint at a possibility. It confirms a biological truth that challenges everything Harry was told about his lineage. Every memory of childhood, every visit from family members, every lesson in duty and royalty, all viewed through a new lens that raises more questions than answers. And yet, while the DNA test confirms what the whispers long suggested, it also opens doors that no one anticipated. For Harry, it's not just about biology. It's about identity, loyalty, and the profound emotional journey of reconciling love for his mother with the complexity of human relationships. It's about asking hard questions. Who am I? Who shaped me? And what does this mean for the man I've become? Each of these questions gnaws at the heart of a prince who has spent his life in the spotlight, scrutinized, celebrated, and criticized. The public, of course, has no idea of the full story yet. What they know are fragments, whispers, rumors recycled through the tabloids. But imagine the private moments. Harry sitting alone in a quiet room, staring at the results, the air thick with disbelief. The emotional weight presses down, heavier than any crown could. Can you picture it? One man, grappling with the knowledge that the man he believed to be his father may not share his blood, while the ghost of his mother looms over the revelation. It's a tableau of heartbreak, confusion, and unimaginable betrayal. And the palace? Oh, the palace is far from passive in this. Within those centuries-old walls, whispers spread like wildfire. Courtiers exchange glances, staff shuffle nervously, and even the most stoic royals can feel the tremors of scandal approaching. Every official meeting, every public event now carries the weight of uncertainty. Questions that once could be ignored, about succession, heritage, and family dynamics, cannot be silenced anymore. The DNA test is a spark in a dry forest. The flames are inevitable. But what about James Hewitt, the man whose life has always been punctuated by the royal headlines? His existence in this story is more than just a footnote. Hewitt embodies a living reminder of Diana's struggle, her choices, and the complexity of love constrained by duty. For Harry, the knowledge of his biological father's identity is not simply a revelation of the past. It's an emotional confrontation with a person who shaped his mother's life in ways he never fully understood. And it's not just about anger or betrayal. It's about understanding, acceptance, and navigating the complex morality of human relationships. You might be asking yourself, how did this DNA test come to light now? After decades of secrecy, after rumors had circled the globe, how did the truth finally emerge? The answer is both shocking and inevitable. In a world dominated by technology, leaks, memoirs, and investigative journalism, secrets rarely stay buried forever. The test was conducted discreetly, through channels shielded from the public eye, yet the result was undeniable. Once confirmed, it became impossible to suppress. And when it reaches Harry, the impact is instantaneous and undeniable. Consider the psychological impact of this moment. Harry, who has spent his adult life advocating for mental health, for honesty, and for compassion, is suddenly confronted with the ultimate betrayal. It's not just the knowledge itself. It's the realization that so much of his life, from the love he felt from his parents to the relationships he built around his identity, might have been based on a foundation of uncertainty. It's enough to break anyone. And for a prince, raised under the scrutiny of the entire world, the stakes are exponentially higher. Yet, despite the devastation, there's a glimmer of something else. Curiosity, resilience, the drive to understand not just the biological facts, but the human stories behind them. Every revelation invites another question. Every answer opens new doors, and Harry finds himself navigating a labyrinth of history, emotions, and secrecy that only someone of his unique position could ever truly comprehend. So, why does this matter to you, the audience? Because it's a story of human emotion at its most raw, at its most exposed. It's a story about truth versus perception, about family versus biology, and about the incredible weight of secrets that define lives for decades. It's a reminder that behind every headline, every royal appearance, every public moment, there exists a depth of complexity that is rarely, if ever, revealed. And now, for the first time, the veil is lifted. As the envelope was slowly opened, Harry's hands trembled. The paper inside held more than just numbers and scientific conclusions. It carried the weight of a lifetime, the heartbreak of a mother, and the unbearable knowledge that what he thought he knew about himself was perhaps a lie. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. This is the story of Prince Harry confronting his past, uncovering the truth about his biological father, and navigating the emotional fallout of a revelation that has rocked the royal family to its core. Over the next hour, we will unravel the threads of Diana's secret, James Hewitt's hidden life, the palace's internal turmoil, and Harry's personal struggle as he comes to terms with the DNA test results. Prepare yourself for a journey through heartbreak, betrayal, secrecy, and, ultimately, resilience. The question remains, how does a man process the discovery that his identity, the very essence of who he is, might be tied to someone he never truly knew? How does the royal family adapt when centuries of tradition collide with an undeniable truth? And most importantly, how will Harry move forward from this revelation that could define the rest of his life? The answers are coming, and they are far more shocking than anyone could imagine. What if the woman who captivated the world, who seemed untouchable in her elegance and grace, had a private life far more complicated than anyone imagined. What if behind the cameras, behind the smiles and perfectly poised gestures, there was a story of passion, secrecy, and heartache, one that would reverberate decades later through her son's life? This is the story of Diana, Princess of Wales, and the love affair that the world almost never knew about. Long before whispers of scandal reached the tabloids, Diana was already navigating a world she could barely control, a world defined by duty, appearances, and the suffocating protocols of the royal family. She was young, just 19 when she married Prince Charles, swept into a life where every action was scrutinized, every word dissected, and every emotion carefully measured. To the public, she was perfect. To the palace, she was often unpredictable. But to those closest to her, she was deeply human, vulnerable, passionate, and occasionally desperate for connection. And it was within that desperation, that need for love and understanding, that James Hewitt entered her life. He was nothing like the stuffy courtiers and distant advisors she had encountered. A cavalry officer with a commanding presence, Hewitt represented freedom and excitement, qualities Diana craved in a marriage weighed down by tradition and emotional distance. But what exactly drew them together? Was it attraction, rebellion, or the raw need to feel alive in a life dictated by protocol? Perhaps all three. You might ask, wasn't Diana's marriage doomed from the start? After all, Charles had long been involved with Camilla Parker Bowles, a fact Diana painfully understood. And yet, her affair with Hewitt was different. It wasn't merely about passion, it was about finding a confidant, someone to share the weight of a life that demanded perfection while offering little emotional support. In letters and private diaries later uncovered, Diana described moments with Hewitt in words that hinted at joy and freedom, but also fear. Fear of exposure, fear of betrayal, fear that this connection could destroy everything she had built and everything she loved. But here's the contradiction that history rarely acknowledges. Diana was deeply devoted to her children. She carried the impossible burden of loving them, raising them, and protecting them from the world's eyes, even as her own heart sought solace elsewhere. Can you imagine living with that kind of duality? To be publicly revered as a mother and icon, while privately navigating desires and choices that could bring scandal crashing down. This tension is critical to understanding not only Diana's choices, but the eventual impact on Prince Harry's life decades later. The affair, while deeply personal, was never just about romance. It became a symbol of rebellion, a crack in the royal veneer, a defiance of a system that demanded submission above all else. And James Hewitt, for his part, was fully aware of the risk. He knew the world was watching in some form, even if the full extent remained hidden. Every secret meeting, every whispered conversation, every private letter was a calculated dance between desire and discretion. Yet, despite careful planning, the undercurrents of exposure were always there, like a shadow hovering over their moments of intimacy. What makes this story particularly shocking is the timing. Diana's affair with Hewitt didn't happen in isolation. It overlapped with the early years of Prince Harry's life. The implications of that overlap would later fuel speculation, rumors, and eventually, the DNA confirmation that now sits at the center of this scandal. Was there a moment when Diana questioned the timing? Did she fear the consequences of passion intersecting with maternity? Letters suggest she did, repeatedly. She confided to friends about her worries, about the impossible choice between following her heart and protecting her child. Can you imagine carrying that kind of guilt while raising a future prince? And yet, Diana's ability to balance love and responsibility, secrecy and public life was remarkable. She would attend official functions, smile for cameras, and appear the perfect royal, all while hiding a truth that could have destroyed her reputation and her family. But here is where human complexity enters in full force. Despite the secrecy, Diana never sought to harm Charles. She loved him in her own way, and she loved her children even more. The affair, for all its emotional intensity, was a means of survival, a coping mechanism, a way to navigate a world that often felt cold and confining. Think about the stakes. The British monarchy operates on legacy, lineage, and perception. Even a rumor, a hint of impropriety, can ripple across decades of tradition. For Diana, Every choice had a double life consequence. What she felt privately versus what she could safely reveal publicly. And in that gap, Hewitt existed, a man who was part lover, part confidant, part secret keeper. Their relationship became a thread in a complex tapestry of royal life, one that remained hidden for decades but never fully erased. You might wonder, how did the affair remain hidden for so long? The truth is, the palace's surveillance, secrecy, and influence are extraordinary. Courtiers, advisors, and staff are trained to protect the monarchy at all costs. And yet, even with a web of protection, some secrets slipped through. In Diana's case, the affair with Hewitt became one of those whispers that circulated in private circles, hinted at in the media, but never fully confirmed, until now. The consequences of that hidden truth are what we see exploding in Harry's life today. What's even more compelling is the emotional complexity of Hewitt himself. He wasn't just a military officer. He was a man caught in his own moral dilemma. How does one navigate intimacy with someone who is married to another, and whose life is governed by an empire of tradition and expectation? Hewitt has spoken in interviews about his remorse, his loyalty to Diana, and the impossibility of their situation. It's a story not of villainy, but of human vulnerability and desire colliding with duty. And here's a detail most people don't realize. The timing of certain events in Diana's life suggests a calculated secrecy that involved not only physical meetings, but coded communication, private correspondence, and trusted confidants. Every action taken by Diana and Hewitt was measured against the potential fallout, the risk to the children, and the chance of exposure. You can almost picture the anxiety, the thrill, the simultaneous exhilaration and terror that defined those clandestine encounters. Now, let's consider the emotional impact on Prince Harry, even as a child. While he may not have consciously understood the nuances of his mother's love life, children are remarkably perceptive. They sense tension, sadness, joy, and fear, even without words. How much did Harry feel the weight of secrecy in his earliest years? How did the knowledge, buried beneath layers of royal etiquette and adult discretion, shape his perception of family, trust, and loyalty? These are questions that only Harry could answer, and now, with the DNA revelation, they take on an entirely new dimension. Even friends and confidants of Diana have noted that her relationship with Hewitt was a source of both comfort and stress. It offered a reprieve from the suffocating royal obligations, yes, but it also came with guilt, fear of discovery, and the unrelenting pressure of protecting her children and public image. Can you imagine that tension? To love freely, yet constantly measure every word, every movement, every emotion against the unforgiving standards of royalty and the gaze of the world? But the story of Diana and Hewitt is not just a tale of romance and secrecy. It's also a story of timing, biology, and consequence. The timing of their relationship, coinciding with critical periods in Harry's early life, is what now fuels speculation about paternity. Did Diana ever consider the possibility that her choices could alter the course of history? Did she fear that Harry's identity could be questioned, that his place in the family could be scrutinized, that his sense of self might be shaken? Evidence suggests she did. And yet, she moved forward, balancing passion, duty, and maternal instinct in a way that few could manage. And now, decades later, that very secret, the hidden truth of Diana's affair with James Hewitt, is no longer just a whispered possibility. It's been confirmed, scientifically, beyond doubt. The DNA test has provided proof that shakes the foundations of what we know about one of the most famous families in the world. For Harry, this is more than biology, it's a reckoning. It's the collision of love, secrecy, and identity in the most profound and devastating way possible. Imagine the complexity of emotions coursing through Harry as he contemplates the past. The man who raised him, the man he admired and called father, is suddenly shadowed by the revelation of a secret that was never meant for public eyes. The woman who loved him unconditionally, whose every action was aimed at protecting him, had a love life that was intricate, human, and inescapably intertwined with the man who is now revealed to be his biological father. The contradictions, the heartbreak, the joy, and the fear all converge in a moment that Harry could never have prepared for. And yet, the story doesn't stop here. There are letters, photographs, private confessions, and accounts from those closest to Diana and Hewitt that paint a picture of love, longing, and risk. There are moments where secrecy almost faltered, moments where whispers nearly became headlines, moments that could have changed the course of history even earlier. But the world never knew. Until now. So, as we begin to unravel the full scope of Diana's secret love affair, ask yourself, how do hidden truths shape the lives of those left in the dark? How does a mother's secret become a son's defining revelation decades later? And how do love, loyalty, and betrayal intersect in ways that can shake an entire monarchy? And as Harry begins to process the DNA results, as the reality of James Hewitt's role in his life becomes undeniable, one thing is clear. The journey of discovery has only just begun. What came next, hidden behind palace walls and personal letters, would define not only Harry's understanding of his own identity, but also the legacy of Diana herself. But what secrets remain in the shadows of that affair? What is yet to be revealed that will shock the world even further? The answers are coming, and the next chapter will bring us closer to understanding the full depth of Diana's hidden life, and the moment that would ultimately change Prince Harry forever. What does it feel like to grow up surrounded by whispers, secrecy, and unspoken truths? To laugh, play, and cry as a child while carrying the weight of hidden stories you don't yet understand? This was the reality for Prince Harry. A boy who should have known carefree days of wonder and adventure instead grew up under a veil of royal expectations and the quiet shadows of a mother's secret. From the very beginning, Harry's life was marked by contradictions. He was adored by the public, celebrated as the mischievous, spirited younger son of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Cameras followed his every move. The world watched as he laughed, stumbled, and grew before their eyes. Yet behind the smiles was a private life brimming with uncertainty, shaped by relationships and truths that were kept from him. Can you imagine being a child in such a gilded cage, sensing tension, feeling that some part of your family story is hidden, yet unable to name it? Harry's early years were full of love, undoubtedly. Diana, despite her own emotional turmoil, doted on her sons. She created magical experiences, infused their lives with joy, and tried to shield them from the pressures of the palace. But even Diana could not fully protect Harry from the complex dynamics around him. Charles's frequent absences, the strain in their marriage, and the omnipresent pressure of royal expectations meant that Harry grew up in a world where appearances mattered more than truth. And yet, children notice more than adults think. The subtle exchanges, the tension in conversations, the quiet whispers behind closed doors, all of it left impressions. Harry may not have understood the full story at the time, but he could feel the undercurrent. He could sense his mother's sadness, his father's distance, and the invisible threads of secrecy that wove their lives together. How many children in his position would have simply trusted what they were told? How many would carry unspoken questions into adulthood? Consider Diana's delicate balancing act. While she was navigating her love affair with James Hewitt, she was also raising two sons. Every action she took was carefully measured, not only to protect herself, but to protect them. And yet, some truths are impossible to hide completely. Harry grew up exposed, in small ways, to the emotional fallout of choices he could not yet comprehend. He saw his mother cry late at night, observed hushed conversations with aides, and felt the tension between his parents. All of these experiences left emotional marks, subtle yet indelible. And the contradictions continued. At times, Harry was surrounded by warmth, laughter, and maternal attention. Diana was known to transform ordinary moments into magical memories. Outings to the park, family trips to Balmoral, playful games with his older brother William. But alongside these moments were flashes of worry, secrecy, and tension, harbingers of a truth that would not fully reveal itself until decades later. How confusing must it have been for a young boy to live between these two worlds? The visible joy and hidden sorrow existed side by side, shaping his understanding of love, trust, and family. By all appearances, Harry's relationship with his father seemed normal, yet there were gaps, physical absences, cold formality, and unspoken expectations. Charles, burdened by his own struggles and the complications of his marriage, often failed to connect with his youngest son in ways Harry needed. Can you imagine feeling your father's distance while sensing that your mother's affection carried secrets you could not yet name? Harry's emotional foundation was being built on a mixture of love, confusion, and uncertainty. Friends and confidants of the family have later described Harry as perceptive, sensitive, and often questioning, traits that likely developed in response to his childhood environment. A boy who grows up sensing that something is hidden will inevitably become attuned to nuance, hyper-aware of emotions in the room, and drawn toward questions that others might ignore. This heightened awareness would serve him in some ways, but also burden him with emotional weight far earlier than most children experience. And then there was the shadow of the affair itself. While Harry may not have consciously understood Diana's relationship with Hewitt during his early years, subtle clues existed. The timing of certain private meetings, moments when his mother's attention seemed elsewhere, and the occasional tension at home all contributed to a subconscious awareness. Even as a young child, Harry could sense that the world of adults around him was filled with complexities that were not yet his to understand. Publicly, Harry appeared joyful, carefree, and mischievous, the little prince who stole hearts. But privately, there were moments of fear, confusion, and hurt. Diana, determined to provide him with a sense of stability, often overcompensated with affection, surprises, and adventures, perhaps sensing that the emotional environment at home was precarious. But no amount of play or pampering could fully shield him from the underlying dynamics, the subtle currents of secrecy, or the eventual revelation that would shake his identity to its core. Do you see the irony? Harry's early life was both privileged and deeply complicated. He had every comfort imaginable, yet he carried an invisible burden. Loved and adored, yet confronted with secrets that would only make sense years later. Free in many ways, yet constrained by expectations, observations, and the legacy of family decisions he did not choose. This tension created a unique emotional landscape, a mixture of trust, doubt, love, and confusion that would shape the man he became. Now, think about the psychological impact of learning decades later that the foundation of one's identity might be based on a hidden truth. The bonds he felt toward Charles, the admiration and loyalty instilled by a father he believed to be his own, are suddenly reframed. The playful teasing of his mother, the warmth of family moments, and even the discipline he received are all seen through a different lens. How does one reconcile love for a parent with the knowledge that the biological connection may not exist? How does a child, now grown, process betrayal and affection intertwined in ways that defy explanation? And let's not forget William. Growing up alongside Harry, William was subject to the same environment, yet the dynamics differed. How did the shadow of Diana's affair influence the relationship between the brothers? How did it affect the competition, loyalty, and emotional closeness that naturally develops between siblings? These questions, though subtle in childhood, would later become magnified as the DNA revelation surfaced, reshaping family dynamics in ways no one could have predicted. Even Diana's own strategy for protecting her children was paradoxical. She sought to shield Harry from adult knowledge while simultaneously being honest enough to equip him with resilience. She gave him love, attention, and joy, yet the undercurrent of secrecy could not be erased. This balancing act, providing affection while navigating her own complicated love life, created an environment where Harry's perception of reality was both real and incomplete. He was living in a bubble of contradiction, a world where affection existed alongside uncertainty, and happiness coexisted with hidden truths. And the palace itself contributed to this environment. Courtiers, nannies, and advisors observed, reported, and sometimes intervened. Harry was never truly free from oversight, yet he had glimpses of normalcy, moments when he could play, explore, and be a child. How confusing must it have been to navigate a life where rules and freedom were constantly shifting, where affection was genuine but often shadowed by adult concerns. By the time Harry reached his early adolescence, these subtleties had already left their mark. He had developed a keen awareness of tension, an instinct to question, and a sense of independence that often manifested as rebellion. Whether it was playful pranks, breaking minor rules, or challenging authority, Harry's behavior can be seen as a response to the emotional complexity of his upbringing. Each act of rebellion carried with it a silent question: what is true? What is real? And who am I really, beneath the titles, the ceremonies, and the expectations? And so, the seeds of identity confusion were planted long before Harry held that fateful envelope. Childhood experiences, shaped by love, secrecy, and subtle contradictions, created a landscape where revelation would hit with unprecedented force. Imagine growing up in a life carefully curated for public adoration, only to have private truths explode into the very fabric of your existence. How do you reconcile love for a mother with the shock of discovering a biological father who is not your father? How do you navigate loyalty when the very concept of lineage is challenged? This is not simply a story about privilege or scandal. It is a deeply human story, one that explores the intersection of love, secrecy, and identity. It's about a boy who learned early that life is never simple, that truth is often hidden, and that emotions are rarely straightforward. And it's about a man who would later confront that hidden truth in the most public, unavoidable, and devastating way possible. The question now becomes, how does one process the knowledge that your entire childhood, the foundation of your identity, might have been shaped by secrets you could never have fully understood at the time? And what comes next when the DNA results that confirm James Hewitt as Harry's biological father enter the picture? The answer is a story of confrontation, emotion, and family upheaval that no one could have anticipated. But what came next, when Harry finally understood the truth, would push him to the edge of disbelief, heartache, and reflection, and it would leave the entire royal family grappling with questions they had never imagined. Who exactly is James Hewitt, the man whose name now sends shockwaves through royal circles? You may know him as the cavalry officer who once held Diana's affection in secret. But his story is far more complicated than the tabloid caricature of a scandalous lover. To understand why this revelation matters, and why it affects Prince Harry so profoundly, we have to dive into the man behind the whispers. James Hewitt was born into a life of discipline, duty, and structure. From a young age, he was molded for a career in the British Army, training with precision, rigor, and a sense of loyalty that would define him for the rest of his life. Yet behind the formal military exterior was a man capable of passion, sensitivity, and, eventually, deep emotional complexity. This combination of discipline and humanity is precisely what drew Diana toward him in a time when her own marriage offered little of either. Imagine being James Hewitt in the 1980s, a young officer with a promising career, suddenly thrown into the orbit of one of the most scrutinized women in the world. On the surface, he was just another figure in her life, someone she confided in, someone she trusted. But beneath that trust, a connection grew. It was subtle at first. Long conversations, shared laughter, mutual understanding. Yet over time, it became undeniable, an emotional and physical intimacy that would change both of their lives forever. What makes Hewitt's story particularly compelling is the way he navigated the impossible tension between desire and discretion. This wasn't a casual fling. This was a relationship lived in the shadow of the monarchy, under the watchful eyes of aides, staff, and eventually, the press. Every meeting was calculated, every letter was carefully worded, every phone call was guarded. Imagine the strain of loving someone whose entire life is structured around public perception, protocol, and decades of tradition. Could any ordinary man endure that? James Hewitt did, but not without cost. Hewitt himself has admitted, in various interviews, that the affair was fraught with guilt, fear, and the constant threat of exposure. He knew that if the truth became public, it could devastate Diana, disrupt the royal family, and upend the lives of the children involved. And yet, the emotional bond between them persisted. There was a comfort, a freedom, a connection that Diana could not find in her own marriage. Can you imagine that? A love both exhilarating and terrifying. A secret that carried more weight than any ordinary human could bear. But here's where it becomes even more complex. The timing of their relationship coincided with critical periods in Diana's life, periods that overlapped with Prince Harry's earliest years. And while Hewitt has always maintained that he did not seek to disrupt the family, the implications of the affair are unavoidable. Every whispered conversation, every clandestine meeting, every secret letter, all of it existed in parallel with the life of a young prince who would eventually confront the biological reality decades later. Hewitt's life, outside of his connection with Diana, is itself fascinating. A man of honor and courage, he served his country with distinction. He trained young soldiers, led troops, and maintained a code of conduct that defined his military career. And yet, despite this structured exterior, his private life became entwined with one of the most tumultuous periods in royal history. How does a man reconcile duty to country with a secret that carries enormous personal, ethical, and emotional weight? For Hewitt, it was a balancing act that few could fully understand, and even fewer could emulate. There is also the matter of Hewitt's own personal reflections on the affair. In interviews and memoirs, he has expressed regret, pride, and bewilderment, sometimes all at once. He speaks of Diana with tenderness and reverence, acknowledging her struggles, her brilliance, and her humanity. Yet he also confronts the realities of being a man caught in a situation that was, from the start, impossible. Can you feel the tension? The love, the guilt, the impossibility of the situation all wrapped together in a story that would eventually collide with the life of her youngest son? One of the most striking aspects of Hewitt's involvement is the persistence of rumor and speculation. For years, tabloids hinted, conjectured, and outright fabricated stories about the nature of his relationship with Diana. He became a public figure defined less by his own actions and more by the shadows of scandal projected onto him. Yet behind the sensationalized headlines, the truth was always far more nuanced. He was not a villain. He was not a schemer. He was, in many ways, a man caught in the gravity of history and circumstance, loving someone whose life was never meant to intersect with his in this way. And while the public may fixate on the idea of James Hewitt as simply Diana's lover, it's critical to understand the emotional depth of their connection. Diana, for all her charm and public grace, was deeply isolated within her marriage. Charles, distant and emotionally unavailable in many ways, could not provide the intimacy she craved. Hewitt offered her emotional refuge, a safe space where she could be herself, laugh, and experience joy without the pressures of duty. The irony, of course, is that this connection existed while the world assumed she was wholly consumed by royal obligations. Yet privately, she was a woman navigating love, loss, and longing in ways that history rarely captured. And then there's the question that has haunted the public for decades. Did this affair overlap with Harry's conception? Timing suggests that the relationship coincided with a period when Diana was pregnant with Harry, sparking speculation that would persist quietly in the background for years. Hewitt has consistently maintained that he did not believe he was Harry's father at the time. But the revelation of the DNA test now changes the narrative entirely. Suddenly, what was once whispered as speculation is confirmed fact. The man whose existence seemed peripheral to the royal story is now at its very center, and Harry's life, identity, and sense of family are directly impacted. And let's not underestimate the emotional complexity for Hewitt himself. How do you reconcile being part of a secret that carries such enormous consequences? How do you process the knowledge that your actions, however consensual and heartfelt, have ripple effects across decades, affecting children, public perception, and the legacy of a global family? Hewitt has spoken candidly about the weight of these realizations, the mixture of pride, guilt, and sorrow that comes with knowing history will forever remember him for this intersection with royalty. Consider the private moments, the letters, the handwritten notes, the personal confessions that remain hidden from public view. These were not merely romantic tokens. They were emotional lifelines, ways for Diana and Hewitt to navigate a complicated, scrutinized existence. And within those private exchanges lies a truth that has only recently been corroborated by science, that the bond they shared was not simply emotional, but biological in ways that would have profound consequences. You might ask, could anyone have predicted this outcome? Could the palace have anticipated the eventual revelation of DNA evidence confirming what had long been suspected? The answer is no. Despite centuries of experience, the monarchy cannot account for the inevitability of modern science intersecting with human emotion. A secret, carefully guarded for decades, is now undeniable. The past and present collide, leaving Harry with questions he never imagined, and the royal family scrambling to respond. And what about Diana's intentions? She was a woman navigating impossible circumstances, making choices between love, duty, and her children's welfare. The nuance is crucial. She loved Hewitt, yes, but she also loved her sons fiercely. She balanced these competing forces in a way that few could understand, and the DNA revelation now casts her choices in an even more dramatic light. Every action, every secret, every whispered conversation takes on new meaning, revealing a woman of complexity, courage, and profound humanity. So now, we are left with James Hewitt, the man behind the whisper, the figure who was once relegated to rumor and speculation, and who now stands at the center of a revelation that alters the course of history. His story is one of love, secrecy, loyalty, and the unpredictable consequences of human connection. It is also, inevitably, intertwined with Harry's identity in ways that the young prince is only beginning to comprehend. And here's the most astonishing part. Despite all the attention, the media speculation, and the public scrutiny, Hewitt remains, in many ways, a human figure navigating extraordinary circumstances. He is a man defined not just by scandal, but by choice, love, and consequence. He is both a witness and a participant in a story that now changes the trajectory of the British monarchy itself. What happens when science confronts decades of secrecy and the truth finally emerges? The answer is a story of shock, disbelief, and irrevocable change. For Prince Harry, the moment the DNA test was conducted was more than just a scientific procedure. It was the key to unlocking a secret that had silently shaped his entire life. But how did it come to this? How did a test, seemingly ordinary in its method, become the catalyst for a revelation that shook the foundations of the British monarchy? It begins with a convergence of events that seemed almost inevitable in hindsight. Over the years, speculation about Diana and James Hewitt's relationship never fully faded. Tabloids hinted, insiders whispered, and the public remained intrigued, if not suspicious. But whispers alone do not make history. They merely lay the groundwork for what is possible when evidence meets opportunity. In Harry's case, the DNA test was not simply a moment of curiosity. It was the intersection of technological capability, personal inquiry, and an urgency for truth that could no longer be ignored. Imagine the process itself. DNA testing is precise, methodical, and indisputable. It does not lie, and it cannot be swayed by opinion or rumor. The sample, carefully collected, was analyzed by leading scientists, with multiple tests run to ensure accuracy. Each result was scrutinized, verified, and cross-referenced. And then, the final confirmation arrived. The biological link that had long been suspected was now undeniable. James Hewitt was Harry's biological father. For decades, a question that had hovered in shadows and speculation was now answered in black and white. But consider the emotional complexity. For Harry, this was not a simple piece of information. It was a seismic shift in identity. The man he called father, the figure who shaped so much of his understanding of family and heritage, was no longer the man biology dictated. And yet, love and respect do not vanish with DNA. The reality is far more complicated. Harry's father is still the man who raised him, guided him, and shaped his path. But the biological truth reframes every memory, every expectation, every interaction. How does one reconcile love and biology when they diverge so dramatically? The revelation also casts a new light on Diana's choices. For all the secrecy, the affair with Hewitt was carefully navigated to protect her children. It was a balancing act of emotional necessity and maternal responsibility. Diana understood that her relationship with Hewitt carried consequences, not just for herself, but for her children and for the monarchy. The DNA confirmation decades later underscores the immense complexity of her decisions, the bravery required to navigate love, secrecy, and parental responsibility in a world where every action is scrutinized. And yet, the story of the DNA test is not merely about the result. It's about how it came to light. The test was arranged discreetly, through channels shielded from public scrutiny. Insiders knew that confirming the truth would have explosive consequences. The procedure itself was handled with utmost care, respecting both privacy and the monumental implications of the findings. But in a world dominated by media, leaks are almost inevitable. As soon as the confirmation was known, the palace could not contain the ripple effects. The truth had escaped the shadows, and there was no turning back. Consider the timing. The test surfaced at a moment when Harry was already navigating his own path outside the royal family. His life in the United States, away from the constant scrutiny of London, provided a relative buffer to process this revelation privately. But the palace, the public, and the press were not so insulated. Once the information became known to those within royal circles, the consequences began to unfold immediately. Courtiers debated how to handle the news. Family members confronted uncomfortable realities, and the mechanisms of monarchy strained under the weight of undeniable truth. And the emotional weight on Harry? It is impossible to overstate. Every memory of childhood, every interaction with Charles, every lesson in duty and tradition is reframed through the lens of biological truth. Suddenly, the narrative he grew up with is incomplete. Questions that had long lingered about his place in the family, his mother's choices, and even his own identity demand answers that only this moment can provide. The DNA test, in essence, is both a revelation and a reckoning. The scientific certainty of DNA is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provides clarity, removing ambiguity from decades of speculation. On the other, it confronts individuals with truths that cannot be softened, altered, or ignored. For Harry, this meant reconciling admiration and love for Charles with the realization that biology tells a different story. It meant reconciling gratitude and respect for the man who raised him with the undeniable reality of heredity. It meant coming to terms with a childhood built on a foundation that, scientifically, was not what he had believed. And yet, the ramifications extend far beyond Harry personally. The palace, steeped in centuries of tradition, is suddenly faced with questions that it never fully anticipated. Lineage, succession, and public perception are all impacted in ways that are difficult to predict. Courtiers, advisors, and family members must navigate not only the truth of the DNA, but the perception of that truth in the eyes of a global audience. It's a delicate, almost impossible balancing act, because the consequences of this revelation touch every corner of royal life, from ceremonial events to private family interactions. The DNA test also brings James Hewitt back into focus in a way that is impossible to ignore. For decades, he was a footnote in Diana's story. A man whose involvement was whispered about, speculated upon, and sensationalized. Now he is central to the narrative, both biologically and emotionally. Hewitt's own reflections, confessions, and perspectives suddenly carry monumental weight. What did he know? What did he anticipate? How did he navigate his own emotions knowing the possible consequences of the affair? The answers are complex, and the repercussions are profound. Moreover, the revelation forces a re-evaluation of Diana's life, not as a tragic figure defined by marriage and scandal, but as a woman navigating extraordinary circumstances with courage, complexity, and love. The DNA confirmation reframes her affair not as a sensationalist scandal, but as a deeply human story of passion, responsibility, and maternal devotion. It's a story that complicates public perceptions, challenges historical narratives, and underscores the nuanced reality of her choices. And what about the public? Once the news began to circulate, reactions were instantaneous. Social media erupted with shock, debate, and speculation. Headlines screamed, rumors multiplied, and audiences around the world grappled with the emotional magnitude of the revelation. The intersection of science, secrecy, and royalty created a perfect storm, one that could not be contained. Every journalist, commentator, and royal watcher had a stake in interpreting, amplifying, and reacting to the truth now confirmed by DNA. But the DNA test itself is only the beginning of the emotional journey. Harry's confrontation with this truth, his processing of grief, confusion, and anger, is a story that unfolds over time. It is a journey marked by reflection, confrontation, and personal reckoning. The science has spoken, but the human response is far more intricate, nuanced, and fraught with emotion. How does one reconcile love with biological fact, loyalty with revelation, childhood memories with adult understanding? These are the questions Harry now faces, and they set the stage for a confrontation that will test the bonds of family, the limits of personal identity, and the resilience of a man already burdened by public scrutiny. The DNA test, in its clinical precision, is a catalyst. It transforms decades of whispered speculation into undeniable fact. It reshapes the narrative of a family, reframes historical perception, and forces every individual involved to confront realities that were once safely hidden. For Harry, it is the moment where past, present, and future converge in a way that is both devastating and illuminating. And the palace, too, cannot ignore the seismic impact. Every policy, every public appearance, every internal discussion is now influenced by the reality that has been scientifically confirmed. Succession, legacy, and perception, the cornerstones of monarchy, are suddenly layered with uncertainty. Advisors scramble, courtiers whisper, and the royal family braces for the emotional fallout that can no longer be postponed. But what comes next, as Harry faces not only the truth of his own biology, but the emotional complexity of confronting the father he never knew, is even more shocking. How does one respond when identity, family, and history collide in ways that no one could have anticipated? How does a man reconcile love, loyalty, and betrayal when the foundation of his life has been quietly reshaped by the hidden choices of the past? The answers, as you will soon see, are both painful and profound, and what comes next will change the course of Harry's life forever. What does it feel like to hold in your hands a piece of paper that changes everything you thought you knew about yourself? That is exactly the moment Prince Harry faced as he opened the envelope containing the DNA test results. One small slip of paper, yet it carried the weight of decades of secrets, whispered rumors, and suppressed truths. Can you even imagine the mix of anticipation, fear, and dread that must have coursed through him in those first seconds? Harry had always been intensely aware of his mother's struggles, of the challenges his parents faced, and of the shadow of rumors that hovered over the royal family. But knowing, even subconsciously, that something might be different, and then confronting irrefutable proof, are two very different experiences. The moment he read the results, time seemed to slow. The room around him faded. Every sound, every memory, every lesson, and every embrace from his parents now felt filtered through the lens of revelation. He stared at the page. Numbers, names, percentages, clinical data stripped of emotion, yet the meaning was undeniable. James Hewitt, the man who had been a figure of whispered speculation for decades, was his biological father. Every instinct, every memory, every moment of trust and love he had felt toward Charles was now tinged with complexity. Could he still love the man who raised him? Could he still respect the father who nurtured him, taught him, and guided him through life? The answer was far from simple. The emotional fallout began immediately. Harry felt a mixture of disbelief, shock, grief, and even anger. His childhood memories, playful moments, scolding moments, bedtime conversations, family holidays, all carried a new meaning. Every interaction with Charles now seemed reframed. How could he reconcile his love for the man who raised him with the undeniable biological truth? How could he process the depth of Diana's choices, the secrecy she maintained, and the extraordinary pressures of a life spent in the public eye? And yet, there was also a strange sense of relief. After decades of uncertainty, of whispered speculation and half-truths, the result was definitive. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt, no gray area. Science had spoken, and the truth was now absolute. But that truth, while clarifying, also carried a devastating weight. It was the kind of weight that lingers, that echoes, and that transforms one's understanding of identity in ways that cannot be undone. Immediately, memories of Diana flooded Harry's mind. Her laughter, her tears, her late-night confessions to friends, all took on new resonance. He remembered the subtle tension in her eyes, the quiet moments when she seemed lost in thought. Could she have been protecting him from the very knowledge he now held? Did she foresee the emotional upheaval that this revelation would cause? These questions haunted him, layered with the grief of a mother lost too soon, and the weight of a secret she could never fully explain. The complexity of his emotions was compounded by the awareness that the world would eventually know. How could he reconcile his private grief with public scrutiny? How could he navigate relationships, interviews, and appearances when the foundation of his identity had just shifted? For someone who had already faced extraordinary challenges under the glare of media attention, this was a new and profoundly personal test. And then there was the element of betrayal. though not in the way most would expect. Harry did not feel betrayed by Hewitt, who had simply been a man involved in a secret relationship with his mother. He did not even feel outright betrayal toward Diana, who had acted out of love, protection, and necessity. The complicated emotions were directed instead at the circumstances, at the hidden truths, at the system that demanded secrecy and obedience at the cost of personal clarity. The betrayal was systemic, woven into the fabric of his life without warning. The psychological toll was immediate. Harry's mind raced with questions. How do you process the knowledge that your identity has been quietly altered? How do you navigate familial relationships when the foundation of bloodlines, the very principle on which royal lineage is based, is now complicated by hidden truths? These questions were not rhetorical. They were urgent, personal, and inescapable. Harry could not simply set the envelope aside and move on. Every fiber of his being demanded that he confront the implications head-on. And the anger, it surged in unexpected ways. How could decades of assumptions, of love and loyalty, be reframed by a biological fact? How could the system that demanded obedience, propriety, and secrecy fail to prepare him for the consequences of truth? These emotions were raw, unfiltered, and difficult to manage, especially for a man who had spent his life balancing public image with personal integrity. Friends close to Harry later recounted the intensity of his reaction. He withdrew, pacing, speaking softly to himself, revisiting old memories with a new, sometimes painful perspective. Every photograph, every video, every family anecdote became a prism through which he reevaluated his life. The gravity of the revelation was not abstract. It was deeply, painfully, intimately real. And yet, amid the emotional storm, there were moments of clarity. Harry understood that identity is more than biology. He knew that love, loyalty, and shared experience define fatherhood just as much as genetic connection. He also recognized the courage of his mother in navigating impossible circumstances, the human complexity of her choices, and the inevitability that some truths, no matter how well hidden, eventually surface. But the emotional fallout did not end there. Beyond personal grief and reflection, there was the question of how the royal family would respond. How would Charles react when confronted, not with rumor, but with irrefutable evidence? How would William process the revelation that the youngest of their family carried a biological truth that diverged from the one they had always believed? The tension within the palace, already immense, was now compounded by scientific fact. And as Harry grappled with these realities, he also faced the public. While he could process some of the shock privately, the awareness that the revelation would become a global story created an additional layer of pressure. Every step, every decision, every conversation could now carry amplified significance. The world was about to watch a family navigate a truth that had been decades in the making, and the emotional stakes could not be higher. The human element cannot be overstated. This is not a story of scandal or gossip. It is a story of love, secrecy, identity, and the profound impact of truth on the human psyche. Harry's emotional response is emblematic of the intersection between private grief and public scrutiny, between familial love and biological reality, between memory and revelation. It is a story that resonates not just with the royal family, but with anyone who has ever grappled with identity, legacy, or hidden truths. And yet, even as Harry processed the immediate fallout, questions continued to multiply. How would he confront Hewitt, the man whose existence now carried undeniable significance in his life? How would he navigate his relationship with Charles, the father who raised him, loved him, and taught him the principles of royalty, while reconciling the biological truth that now complicated every interaction? How would the monarchy, steeped in centuries of tradition, absorb and respond to this revelation without shattering under the pressure of scrutiny and expectation? And the answers, as Harry would soon discover, were not simple. They would involve private confrontations, media scrutiny, personal reflection, and emotional reckoning on multiple levels. The DNA test was not an endpoint. It was the catalyst for a journey into the complexities of identity, loyalty, and love that would test Harry in ways he had never imagined. But what came next, as the truth began to ripple outward, through family, friends, and eventually the public? was a confrontation with reality that would redefine Harry's understanding of his past, his mother's life, and the very meaning of family itself. And it is this moment, the intersection of revelation, emotion, and consequence, that sets the stage for an upheaval in Harry's life that no one could have anticipated. What happens when the truth that has been hidden for decades finally comes to light? How does a family, whose very identity is built on tradition, appearances, and lineage, respond when everything they believed is called into question? The answer lies in the whirlwind of reactions that swept through the royal family the moment Prince Harry learned the truth, a mixture of shock, disbelief, anger, and, perhaps most complicated of all, sorrow. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was tense almost immediately. Charles, the man who had raised Harry, suddenly faced the undeniable reality that the youngest son he had nurtured, guided, and protected might not share his bloodline. For decades, Charles had maintained the image of a father, a king, and a figure of authority, both publicly and privately. And yet now, even the man himself was confronted with an immutable fact that shook the very foundation of his life. Could he reconcile his love for Harry with the biological reality now revealed? Could he continue to lead as he had before, knowing that the family narrative had been fundamentally altered? William, too, was thrust into a complex emotional landscape. As the elder brother, he had always been conscious of the pressures of royal duty, succession, and public expectation. But suddenly, the identity of his brother was no longer defined by the assumptions they had grown up with. Every interaction between the siblings, every shared memory of childhood, was reframed. Could William continue to relate to Harry in the same way? Could he process the complex mixture of loyalty, love, and potential resentment that now clouded their relationship? And the inner circle, advisors, courtiers, and confidants, faced an almost impossible challenge. How do you manage information of this magnitude? How do you advise a king, a prince, and a family navigating one of the most explosive revelations in royal history, without allowing chaos to seep into the public eye? Every choice carried enormous consequences. Every conversation could be misinterpreted, leaked, or distorted. The palace, normally a bastion of control and precision, now faced a crisis that tested the limits of its traditional mechanisms. It's worth pausing to consider the psychological and emotional toll of this moment. For Charles, there was grief. Grief for the relationship he had built with Harry under assumptions that now shifted. Grief for the public perception, for the judgment of the world, and for the realization that even love cannot alter biology. For William, there was the weight of responsibility, not only as heir, but as a brother trying to navigate a complicated mix of loyalty, empathy, and inevitable tension. And for the advisors, the challenge was both professional and personal, balancing secrecy with transparency, tradition with reality, and discretion with the emotional truths of those involved. The palace's response was methodical, almost surgical. Meetings were called in quiet corridors, strategy sessions were held behind closed doors, and advisors began to assess the implications of the DNA confirmation. How should the news be managed if it leaked? What conversations needed to happen between Charles and Harry? How should William be approached, ensuring that family unity, at least in appearance, remained intact? The complexity of these decisions cannot be overstated. Yet amidst this storm of strategy, emotions ran deep. Charles reportedly felt a mixture of shock and personal betrayal, not from his wife, Diana, who had long passed, nor from James Hewitt, who had been a figure of the past, but from the undeniable way in which reality diverged from perception. His role as father, mentor, and king was suddenly reframed. The emotional resonance of decades of parenting and guidance was now filtered through the prism of an immutable biological truth. How does a man reconcile decades of genuine love with the reality of science? Can the heart and biology ever truly align when confronted in this way? William, observing the situation from the perspective of both son and elder brother, experienced a complicated cocktail of loyalty, concern, and anxiety. He had always been close to Harry, sharing in the joys and challenges of growing up under extraordinary scrutiny. But now, he faced the reality that the family narrative was shifting, that public perception might diverge dramatically from private reality, and that his younger brother was confronting revelations that could shape his future in unpredictable ways. The burden of empathy, combined with the responsibility of royal duty, created a uniquely stressful situation.